Hello everyone, my name is Susan Morales and my YouTube channel focuses on learning how to follow Jesus in an everyday kind of way. Here we explore topics related to the Christian life, including theology and apologetics. Please subscribe to hear more content like this. Today we'll be talking about an important piece of evidence that Christianity uniquely offers. Many of us take comfort in simply believing what the Bible says about how we are saved. For instance, Romans 10:9 says, "If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." However, some of us, after hearing this, would ask the following question: is there evidence that Jesus resurrected? Many Christian apologists argue that the deaths of Jesus' apostles serve as great evidence. But outside of what the Bible tells us about the fate of these apostles, what evidence do we have that what the Bible claims is true? My guest, Dr. Sean McDowell, is a Christian apologist and author who has studied in depth on this topic and has written a book called The Fate of the Apostles, which I have right here. Let me show you. And he'll be helping us think through this topic today. So thank you, Sean, so much for being here today.
You are welcome, and I'm sorry you had to spend so much on that academic book. It was out of my control, but good for you. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So how long ago did you write this book?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question because I'm just going to start working this fall on a 10-year update to the book. So it first came out in 2015, which means I started my dissertation or my doctoral research about 2010. So the research itself is 12, coming up on 15 years ago. And there's been movements like this in academia work more slowly than Twitter trends obviously do, but there's been quite a few changes and updates. And so I'm really looking forward to the 10th anniversary edition that's coming up.
So can you tell us a little bit about what we can expect at
Sure.
edition?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So basically, for those who are not familiar, this book is rooted in my doctoral research. And I'm trying to ask the question, what do we know about the fates of the apostles of Jesus, his 12 disciples, and then Paul and James, the brother of Jesus? And do their deaths in any way help build the case for the resurrection? So I looked at them historically, first century, second century, third century documents, and came to the conclusion that of those 14, we have a high historical probability of 4 of them: Peter, Paul, James, the son of Zebedee, and James, the brother of Jesus. And then Andrew and Thomas are at least more plausible than not. The rest, it's really hard to know where history ends and where tradition begins. That's my premise. But the heart of the argument is we don't have to prove they all died as martyrs. I think their willingness to suffer and die shows that they sincerely believe they had seen the risen Jesus. That's the piece of this. Sometimes apologists have said, and even other well-meaning Christians and pastors and others, and even myself years ago would say things like, they all died as martyrs except for John, therefore Jesus rose from the grave, Christianity's true. I started to realize that is a very just not airtight, to say the least, argument, that it just doesn't follow logically. What this does is show they're not liars, and they're minimally proclaiming something they think is true. They're sincere. So in this update, there's been a few slight areas where I've tweaked my assessment of the facts that I will work in. I think the large premise still stands. There's some facts that have been brought to my attention. For example, when Paul is beheaded, it describes that this milk-type substance comes out. This is a writing called the Acts of Paul. And I just wrote that off to myth. And I had a doctor contact me and say, there is a medical phenomena where somebody under extreme stress has a milk-type substance come out of their neck. Now, that doesn't prove that happened to Paul, but that gives me pause in saying, well, maybe it's not purely mythological. Maybe not. I don't think anymore that Peter was crucified on the cross, let alone crucified upside down. Partly because in crucifixion, somebody was stripped naked to shame and humiliate them. But in the Gospel of John, I don't know how I missed this. It says that he would be taken where he did not want to go and would be clothed by another. Well, that's exactly what doesn't happen in crucifixion. Now, of course, John says an indication of how he would die. So he still died as a martyr, I believe, but I'm leaning against him being crucified. So there's a few things that I just would assess differently, but there's also a number of scholars, people like Bart Ehrman, people like Richard Carrier, uh, some other scholars, Dale Allison, who have spoken on this issue, and I'm going to write some responses to their critique.
Okay, and for the just a common Christian, the normal Christians out there, what you just said about Peter not having died upside down on a cross, that just seems like common knowledge among Christians. So is that
Yeah.
is that something that tradition has taught us, or we've kind of just assumed it as we read the Bible?
Yeah, if somebody asked me for years how Peter died, I would have said he died crucified upside down because he considered himself not worthy to die in the manner of Jesus. Well, let me just ask you a basic question. Do you think the Romans were in the business of asking people how they wanted to be crucified and then following their requests? Of course not. That's the opposite of what crucifixion was. So, yes, it appears in church history. If I remember correctly, it's around the 3rd century. And then other church historians start talking about it. It might even be the 4th century. So it's not in any of our earliest sources at all. And I think, what a number of scholars that I read would say is that so actually, let me take a step back. The Acts of Peter, which is the end of the 2nd century, this apocryphal account does have him being crucified upside down. But the story is not that he considers himself unwilling and unworthy like Jesus. Rather, the world has been turned upside down. So as Peter is upside down, he can actually see the world as it really is. And his death, kind of like Jesus' death, but in a different fashion, will help turn the world right side up. That's one way of taking, I think arguably a more plausible way of taking the earliest source we have, end of the 2nd century, and then later church historians, 3rd and 4th century, start picking that up as being historical. So I'm not even convinced he was crucified, let alone crucified upside down, but I do believe he died as a martyr. We have multiple sources for that, and very few people question that account. Now, by the way, this is surprising to folks who haven't followed this. This is what happens when we start to study the apostles. There's a lot of stories we've been told, but we've never really examined them, myself included. That's a part of what led me into this journey, was like, wait a minute, I've heard that Bartholomew is skinned alive. Is that really true? And then you start to probe the data, and the earliest source I could find is like 500 AD. That tells me it's not necessarily false, but our evidence that happened is pretty late.
At least if someone does want to say that, they can say that happened 500 years later. That's what we're going with. But this is fascinating because I remember hearing you talk. I think it was on this book on Mike Winger's channel a long time ago, and I was still really new into learning about apologetics and this topic, and I couldn't understand how you were talking so much like as an academic, as a Christian scholar, because I was coming from a place where Christians are just supposed to believe everything that the Bible says, and I felt like the way that you were talking about these things, even if I would have heard what you just said right now, I would have wondered if that means that we are doubting the Bible or we can't trust what the Bible says. So did you want to comment a little bit about how those things work together?
Yeah, sure. So keep in mind, by assessing the deaths of the apostles and the crucifixion of Peter, I'm not doubting the biblical account. The Bible doesn't tell us that Peter was crucified. The Bible only addresses the fate of James, the son of Zebedee, brother of John, in Acts 12, and the death of Peter at the end of John, but it doesn't describe crucifixion. My goal is to say, as an academic, now this is a little different question than I would ask as a Christian. As a Christian, I believe the Bible is inspired. I believe it's trustworthy, and my goal is not to question it. But if I'm writing and researching in the broader academic community, and my book is published by Routledge Press, which is an academic publishing house, not a Christian source, I can't just say, well, it's in the Bible, that settles it. I believe it. I have to look at John and Acts as historical sources and assess them in the way that scholars look at historical sources. So it's not that I'm doubting the Bible. I just put on my scholarly hat, so to speak, and I'm asking the question, what can we know through the lens of historicity? Now, a lot of the other things that I'm challenging, or at least trying to get to the root of, are not things in the scripture. They're just Christian tradition. The church fathers taught, stuff that we've heard that we've never really looked at. Maybe they come from Fox's Book of Martyrs, written hundreds and hundreds of years later. And he got so many things wrong in that book. So I'm not doubting the Christian faith. I'm just looking at through a scholarly lens and making a case to other scholars about what we can know happened to the apostles in terms of their fates and what this might mean for our confidence in the resurrection.
So, on that note of doubt, I did want to talk very briefly about your background. You are the son of a well known Christian apologist, and I wanted to ask you if you wanted to share about if you had any experiences with doubt growing up, and also how your experience writing this book was like, if it also caused you to have some questions, or you were stuck with a question, maybe it brought up some doubts. Yeah, did you want to comment on that a little bit?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So you mentioned that I had a apologist father. Some might recognize the name Josh McDowell. I mean, his books have sold, I don't know how many tens of millions of copies. He's spoken, what they tell us is, to more young people live outside of social media and YouTube than anybody in history. So he's had a massive influence. And I just believe Christianity growing up. Went through a period of doubt in college, partly in the mid 90s when I started fishing around on the internet. And a lot of the atheist secular web begun, as far as I could tell, responding to some of my dad's material chapter by chapter. And it was pretty unsettling, to say the least. I had never heard smart doctors, historians, lawyers, philosophers challenging this material. To make a long story short, obviously ended up concluding that it's true and believing that it makes sense, and hence am an apologist. That period of doubt was long before I started working on this dissertation, probably a decade and a half earlier or so, maybe actually probably 2 decades earlier. So this, partly what I was trying to do is just taking certain popular arguments that have been made and ask if they stand up to academic rigor and scrutiny. And I learned basically 2 things. The heart of the argument is good, but certainly at times we've overstated it and overplayed our hand what we know historically and what follows from this evidence. And that includes myself, just learning, hearing this stuff, never really questioning it. But when you do a doctoral dissertation, you have to dot every I and you have to cross every T, and you have to defend it before a committee. And then ultimately, to publish this, there's a number of outside academic reviewers, even to get this update. Before Routledge agreed, they sent it out to, I think, 2 or 3 different reviewers who talked about whether or not the scholarship is sound and legitimate, et cetera, even if they disagree with the conclusions. And so I think the basic argument stands, but I think we've overstated what we can know about some of the apostles and have to focus more on their sincerity and that they're not liars, and the handful that we do know, rather than saying 11 of the 12 died as martyrs, refusing to recant their faith, we just can't establish that in the way we've often stated it. So it didn't make me doubt more. It gave me greater confidence in the testimony of the apostles, but also made me take a step back and say, okay, I've got to be careful here. I've got to not overplay my hand for the sake of having integrity.
Yeah, because sometimes we feel that we need to overstate something, but Christians don't need to do that because what we have, even if it's not so dynamic, like it's sounding, like, like how you explained, well, we have evidence for these apostles, not all of them. And some might feel like, oh, well, that sounds weak, compared to just saying they all died. But what we do have is pretty powerful still. I did want you to talk to the beginner Christian or beginner Christian apologist about sometimes as we're learning about these topics, we do come across things that we never considered before, and we might get a little stuck on a question, and it might impact us, our walk with God, while we're in that place of being stuck. Maybe you can relate when you were listening to those
Sure.
atheists. So how would you, what wisdom would you share with us about being in that place and how we can still have that relationship with God even though we're kind of stuck?
This is a great question. The first thing I encourage people to do is to take a deep breath. You're not the first person who's had this question before. I guarantee you somebody has wrestled with this question. And one thing we know for sure, certain with Christianity, is there is a deep intellectual tradition going back to the time, obviously, before Jesus, through Paul, to the first church fathers, through Augustine, through Aquinas, brilliant people taking seriously the idea of loving the mind, loving God with our minds, and offering responses to the toughest challenge. So take a deep breath. It might feel new to you, but it's not new. If you're willing to do the research and track it down, I've consistently found that there are good answers for the toughest questions. Now, my confidence in that has grown in a way it didn't. When I was an undergrad going through this doubting season, I went to J.P. Moreland, who's one of the leading philosophers in the world. And he was teaching apologetics. And I go to his office hours a few times, and he said to me, he goes, you know what, Sean, I've done this a lot, that there's new questions, and I just have the confidence answers are out there if I'm willing to find them. And I remember thinking, that must be nice, because I didn't feel that way. Now, having done this for a couple decades plus, I do have that confidence. I know if I'm willing to look for it, there are plausible answers for the toughest objections. So take a deep breath. Know there's an answer out there if you're willing to find it. The last thing I'd say is don't bury it down inside. What happens to people is they just have a little doubt about the Bible, a little doubt about the problem of evil, a little doubt about the resurrection, a little doubt about a biblical view of sexuality, and they suppress it. And then honestly, it can grow like a cancer until it just wrecks your faith. So if you have doubts, just tell somebody. Now, we don't always do a great job in the church of responding to people that have doubts. Gary Habermas has said, and by the way, if you're looking for a book on this, Gary Habermas's work on this is just fantastic. You can search his name. He's written 2 books about this. And he has a real combination of kind of a pastoral, psychological angle and an intellectual angle. He says in the church, we can confess almost any sin, but you say you doubt and people just freak out. So tell somebody that's safe, get it off your chest, and that just helps it breathe so you're not burying it. Research shows with young people that it's not just doubts that cause them to leave their faith, it's unexpressed doubts. So take a deep breath, know there's an answer, tell somebody. But for me, I also use my doubts to research. I have a friend, he's a pastor, he just never doubts anything. He's literally got the gift of faith. I'm like, give me some evidence, how you know? And it hit me one time. I was like, he doesn't write 300 plus page dissertations on the deaths of the apostles. He's not bugged enough about the question because he has faith. So doubting is something that I think God can use in my life to motivate me to study more. if I didn't have doubts, I would not try to seek and study and think as much as I do. So try to see the positive of it if you can.
Yes, definitely being a mom for me has pushed me in that direction of
Mm,
having to learn more apologetics. I actually had a conversation with my daughter, and that's why I started this video with that Bible verse, because we were just talking about how we can have trust. We can trust that there's this eternal life for us because we put our trust in Jesus. But there's always these little questions that I think, especially as children, and you know, because you're a dad, right? You're a dad of how many?
I got 3 kids, almost 19, almost 16, and 10.
10? Oh, yeah. My daughter is 9 years old. She just turned 9.
Mm,
So it's just like an age where a bunch of questions start to pop up.
yeah,
And so it was interesting for her to, I guess she didn't realize that there's evidence for these things. And so that got our conversation going. And then I was like,
good.
I probably should talk to someone like, oh, I have that book. I have Sean McDowell's book. Maybe I should have a conversation with him. And because as a Christian, I used to be one of those people that I'm fine. I have complete faith, but I also wouldn't like go there. You know, I wouldn't ask those questions. So I'm fine over here, right?
Mm,
But yeah, I've also reached that place where if I don't have a question, like how I felt, like I don't have an answer, so let me look for a book, that gives me information. So as a mom, I can help my child because she does want to ask these questions, and so I do need to go there. um,
good.
yeah. So in the beginning of your book, you talk about how the sincerity of the apostles is important, and that's something you emphasize. And you do mention that there are other religions that they can claim that they also have martyrs. So, what would you say in particular is unique about the sincerity of these apostles? And so my question is it the message, the claim that Christianity makes about
Yeah.
Jesus' resurrection? Is that the
Yeah,
difference?
this is a great question. Sometimes I think Christians have said things like there's only martyrs within Christianity. In her book, The Myth of Persecution, Candida Moss responds to this. And I think she's right that it's not only Christians who have martyrs. Now, I wish Christians hadn't said that because that's not true. We see martyrs in all sorts of religions, of course, depending on how you define martyr, but we have Buddhists who, for a cause, sacrificing their lives in the Vietnam War, just protesting protesting the war in a sense. We have Jews who would willingly lay down their lives for the law. We see this in the Old Testament. We see it during the Maccabean period that's recorded in the book of Maccabees. So it's not just that Christians have martyrs. It's the question is, what is somebody willing to suffer and die for? So in the case of the Maccabean martyrs, they were willing to suffer and die out of a refusal to disobey the law. They would not disobey the law, and that was worth dying for, which shows their sincerity. Christian martyrs throughout history, of course, die because they think Christianity is true. But what's unique about the apostles is they're the ones who traveled with Jesus somewhere between 2 and 3 years. They saw him minister to people. They saw him perform miracles. They heard his teachings. They saw him arrested and knew he was crucified, claimed to have seen him risen from the dead. At least that's the earliest claim in the Gospels, the book of Acts, and the writings of Paul, that they are witnesses that haven't seen the risen Jesus. So when they go intentionally put themselves in harm's way with a willingness to be martyred, this shows that their actions are not just, we're on Team Jesus, but their actions are, we're on Team Jesus, because to be on Team Jesus is to believe that Jesus has risen from the grave, and we are witnesses of this event itself. So their sincerity is not just for a good cause. It's actually for the claim that Jesus has risen from the grave. So I think it has a different evidential value for their claims than other martyrs, so to speak. Like, for example, if I died as a martyr, as morbid as that is to think about, that wouldn't prove anything about Christianity. It just showed that I was sincere. But I didn't see Jesus risen from the grave. I didn't travel with him. Nothing about the truth of Christianity rests upon my testimony in a way it does for the apostles.
So they're unique martyrs, even within comparing them to other Christian martyrs.
Yeah, and I don't think we can show they're all martyrs, as I said before,
Yeah.
but some of them I think died as martyrs, but their willingness to suffer, like we see in the book of Acts, shows that their testimony is unique, backed up by a willingness to experience martyrdom.
And so, what exactly would I know you talk about it at in depth in the book? So, is there like a short way you would explain what the evidence is for those that you do believe died as martyrs?
So that is a big question. And I have a chapter for each of the apostles.
Mhm.
And what I basically do is I look at the quantity and the quality of the evidence and try to make a historical assessment that's reasonable. So take Peter, for example. There's more evidence for Peter that I could find than any of the other apostles. There's roughly 10 sources in the first and the second century with varying degrees of strength and clarity, but they unanimously agree that Peter died as a martyr. And some of those sources point towards Rome, and there's no evidence to the contrary. These are Christian sources, non-Christian sources. Get to Paul, I think it's 8 sources that we find. So 2 less, but still, first century, second century, common, consistent pattern, no competing narrative that Paul, in fact, died as a martyr in Rome. That's really solid ground. Get to James, the brother of Jesus. The evidence now is first century and second century. We have Jewish, Gnostic, and Christian sources that all agree, although there's less sources. There's agreement. What makes this unique is it's not just Christian sources, biblical or extra biblical. There's also Jewish source, Josephus, and certain Gnostic sources that agree together. That tells me we're on pretty solid ground. Now, James, the son of Zebedee, that's one that is stated clearly in the book of Acts, chapter 12. So there's only one initial early source. There's none to the contrary. There's no other stories I could find. There's other travels of James that are probably fictional, but as far as I could tell, they all have him coming back to Jerusalem and being martyred in AD 42. So if Acts is a historical reliable source, and you can make a case for that, then we have good reason to believe that that account of James is true. Now, when you get to Andrew and Thomas, now we have less sources, and they're into the middle to the end of the second century and or the third century. So we have less sources, numerically speaking. They're more removed in time, and some of those sources are also legend-filled. So can we trust them at all? Can we trust them a little bit? That's where I concluded that they're at least more plausible than not, but that's like a 51 to 55%, if I had to put a number on it, level of confidence. The other apostles, I couldn't really tell when history ends and legend begins. For these, you're really moving into the 4th and 5th centuries and beyond, where it seems like the legend becomes completely disassociated from a historical core, and it seems that their creativity just expanded. And what makes it hard is you have certain cities that if they could have a founding apostle for their city, there's a certain kind of authority that they would have. So there becomes incentive to kind of invent these stories, whether with good intention or not. That's why with Bartholomew, if I can remember, I must have found 4 or 5 or 6 different ways, according to traditions, that he died, that he was skinned alive, that he was burned, that he was, I think one he was shot with arrows. I think one he's crucified, one he's thrown in the ocean. Well, clearly all of those didn't happen. And I just didn't have the ability, I'm not sure anybody does, to say, are they all false? Is one of them true? That's where we just don't know.
And from what I'm hearing, again, as a common Christian, what we hear a lot as evangelicals is stay away from certain books and just read the books that
Mm,
are in the canon that we've accepted. But for what I'm hearing you say is that we can use a lot of these books to make a very good claim about what is claimed in the Bible. So although we don't accept them as canon, you have used them in your research. Did you want to comment on that a little bit?
sure. I think as Christians, we should read non-Christian books. I've taken a group of high school students through books like Letters to a Christian Nation by Sam Harris, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. I want them to read these, not be threatened by these ideas, and learn how to respond to them and make sense of them. So I think we should read non-Christian books. The only pause I would give is I recently interviewed a woman who's a former witch. And at 13, her dad gave her a book on witchcraft. And when she came out of witchcraft, she burned it. There are certain books like that with spiritual forces, I would say many Christians should not read unless they are in the right place spiritually. That's the only kind of pause I would put on that. But I think as Christians, if we have the truth, we shouldn't be afraid to engage ideas that are out there. So there's a lot of books like the Gospel of Thomas that has certain Gnostic ideas and other possibly even pantheistic kinds of ideas embedded in them. Well, it's not an actual gospel. It's not in the canon, but it's interesting. It tells us something about the second century church, what was believed. We should read it, just not in the same way we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A lot of the sources I read are church fathers like Clement of Rome, who is writing in the 90s. So this is really the generation afterwards that arguably overlapped with the apostles. These are church fathers. These are wonderful people to read doctrinally, historically, people like Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, Irenaeus. These are the generation or two that the apostles, so to speak, handed the baton to, and then they carry the faith forward. There's huge value in reading these. I would encourage Christians to.
Do you have 5 more minutes?
Let's do a couple more questions. I can pull that off for you, Susan.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you out of curiosity if you came across any research about the women disciples, if they suffered as well, and just curious.
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I had to limit my research somewhere. So I thought about Mark. There's stories of Mark being dragged to death by a horse. I thought about Luke. I thought about analyzing Stephen as a martyr. And I thought about the women in terms of Mary, because I think a really strong case could be made that she was the first, or the women are some of the first witnesses to the risen Jesus, because they wouldn't have invented women as the first witnesses in that time. I decided not to expand further than that, partly because I just, in my initial search, didn't see any good, compelling early evidence for their martyrdom. Doesn't mean it's out there. I just didn't find it initially, and so didn't go down that road. If somebody's watching this and sends me stuff and it's out there, I would love to see it. I would love to probe into that. Now that you mention it, maybe I will add that in my update. Maybe I'll look into it. I honestly hadn't even thought about it, but that's a great idea. I'm going to give that some thought.
Thanks, because you also mentioned, and this will be the last question, you mentioned about living memory. And I just wondered how did that factor into what the apostles believed about Jesus, the living memory of, for example, Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Mary Magdalene, the first disciple that saw Jesus resurrected.
Okay, so here's what I mean by the living memory. Is it's basically, it would carry the apostles through the third generation, roughly to the end of the second century. And what I mean by that is a kind of story that's told from somebody that that's been passed on, not from generations removed. But my grandfather, as crazy as it is, was born in 1898. 1898. My dad is 83 years old. And I think his grandfather, if I do the math, was maybe in his late 40s or 50s. I never met my grandfather. He died as an alcoholic. But had I met him, he could have told me stories about his dad or his grandfather going back to like the mid early 1800s that he is kind of faithfully passing on to me. That's what I mean by a living memory. So, as best I could, and this is a term Marcus Mockmull uses in his work on Peter, is I was trying to say, what sources do we have within the living memory? So, through the end of the 2nd century, there's a certain weight that they would have. Now, that doesn't mean something after is false. It doesn't mean something in the living memory is true, but it's just kind of a historical core that I took. And those 4 apostles that I said are reliable, we have good substantive material in that living memory. The 2 I'm not so sure about are getting to the end of the living memory. The rest are all far beyond that living memory. So I just conclude that I don't know how much we can trust those accounts.
I just wonder sometimes how the authors of the Gospels got the information that it seems that only the women experienced in those moments.
Mm.
So I'm guessing the original apostles must have had communication with these women and passed that information on to the other disciples of the apostles. I'm
Well,
wondering about that.
sure. So read Luke chapter 1. Luke says, many have undertaken to write up an account of the things that happened amongst us. But I have carefully investigated everything since the beginning to write to you, O Theophilus, a careful account so you can have the certainty of the things therein. What is Luke saying? Probably writing his gospel into the end of the 2nd century at some point, maybe not that late, but somewhere between 60s and 80s, probably. Point being, Luke did his research.
Mm-hmm.
He talked to people. He
Mm-hmm.
looked at these accounts. He investigated with witnesses and is writing a careful account. So if all 4 gospels report that women discovered the empty tomb, of course,
Mm-hmm.
as careful historians writing a record that they believe is of God in human flesh, are
Mm-hmm.
going to talk with the women and talk with the others and do their best to get an accurate account.
Okay, thank you so much. Is there any further resources that you would recommend for people that want to continue studying or maybe start their own investigation like you did on this topic?
You know what? It's interesting. I have a book. I don't know when you're posting this, but I have a book literally coming out the end of April called Evidence for Jesus.
Mm.
And it's a great intro. You've talked about kind of just normal folks, moms and dads beginning. There's a chapter in here on the deaths of the apostles, where I just kind of simplify it as best I can. But how we know the Bible is true. Jesus rose from the grave, claimed to be God. In Evidence for Jesus, there are short, quick chapters to talk with your kids, do a small group study on it. A great place to begin. So that's probably the top one I would commend.
Awesome. You said April or when is it?
End of April, but I think people can already pre-order it.
Oh, good. I'm so glad you
Yeah.
shared that. Yes, I'll definitely look into that. And where can people follow you and keep up with your work?
The central hub is seanmcdowell.org, but I have a YouTube channel. I'm on Twitter, even post videos on TikTok, use Instagram. But if they want to find the hub that connects to my blog and my speaking and all the different worlds, seanmcdowell.org would probably be the place to start.
You also always share about how you are, I think, a professor at Biola, and you also always offer like this promo code at the end of your videos, I think, or on the bottom of your
Yeah,
description. Actually, enrolled in the online Biola Christian Apologetics credential program
good for
using
you.
your promo code. So definitely
Good.
would recommend people also check out your links.
So that's below my YouTube channel.
Mhm.
We have a certificate program for folks who want kind of just a formal way to study and someone to guide them and just give the most simple assignments to just kind of force you to learn and commit to this. If you go to my YouTube channel below, I have a discount code that's actually pretty significant. And then when we're done with that, Susan, we hope you'll join us in the master's program. We have a lot of moms who are doing this and just take it one class at a time. But given your love and interest in this topic, I hope you'll think about joining us sometime.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I'll definitely consider it very seriously. So thank you again for your time, Sean. May God bless you for making time from your very busy schedule, and we really do appreciate everything you do and how you're growing. Your platform is just growing on YouTube, and that's very valuable. So thank you so much for investing time into doing that.
Thanks, Susan.